On this episode of Real Estate Insiders Unfiltered, we talk about the national debt, housing oversupply. Yes, you heard that right, not an undersupply, and also some really incredible parenting advice. It's going to be an incredible show. Tune in. You talk about it privately, we talk about it publicly. This is the Real Estate Insiders Unfiltered podcast. Welcome again to Real Estate Insiders Unfiltered podcast. I'm your host, James Dwiggins, along with my co-host, Keith Robinson, aka Crazy Uncle Keith.
Yes,
by the way, we have
sir.
some new quotes in this episode, which we'll get to in a little bit. Keith, tell us, Mr. Fanboy, about our guest today and what we covered.
I've loved all of our guests, but this one for me was a special day. I've been a follower and admirer of Ivy Zelman, the co-founder of Zelman Associates, for years. I go to her conference religiously every single year. It's the best economic forecast, thought, think tank, positioning your company in the right way for the coming years conference that I've ever been to.
She's a pretty big guest because I've seen her all over the news and interviews and everything else.
She's been on Bloomberg, CNBC, you name it. She's been there talking about it. We covered a bunch of different topics. We talked about, actually, interestingly enough, she has an opinion that we have a housing oversupply, not the undersupply that's often reported. We talked about the national debt, what it was like coming up as a young lady on Wall Street in the alpha male environment.
Great conversation.
Yes. And she also gave us some life skills as two fathers of strong young women. So we covered all the bases with Ivy. It was awesome.
Yeah. It's an incredible show. Tune in. Ivy, welcome to the show. We are super excited to have you here and have you grace our podcast. I know I will start with, you have a fanboy on this podcast. Keith, you've been to all of the conferences, I think.
Well, all of them since I heard about them. They've been going on for a long time. But the Zelman conference is one of my can't miss conferences. I tend to go there and have Ivy and her team fill my brain full of knowledge and then come back and regurgitate it, and then everyone thinks I'm brilliant. So now
that is true, by the way.
Now my secret's out.
Well, thank you, Keith. I appreciate that. We love the sport. By the way, we were doing it 16 years at Zelman, and I've been doing it for 30 years when I worked at the bulge bracket firm. So 6
you've
years.
Been doing it for a long time. Yeah.
He sends pages and pages of notes, by the way, of which I can't understand half of it. So I just ask him, where are we going, Keith? And he gives us this update. So
he just has me do thumbs up, thumbs down, like a Facebook post or something.
Yeah. So Ivy, let's start with this because we got a lot of questions in a short amount of time with you. First, just tell the listeners and viewers a little bit about your background, current role. How did the path look like getting where you are today, et cetera?
Okay, my background. Well, I actually started out in New York going to a community college called Baruch, City College, and worked my way through getting my undergrad degree. It took me 6 years, wound up community college in Northern Virginia called Nova, fell in love with a guy and moved for love. And I did that twice. Eventually, my husband is now an ex-husband. So I went to Nova. Then I finished my undergrad at George Mason. I majored in accounting. I worked as a administrative assistant at an accounting firm. Now, for those not old enough to remember, Arthur Young. That was Ernst & Young, and I don't even know what they are now. But I asked all these accountants. I said, I'm majoring in accounting. Do you like doing what you're doing? And they were like, hell no. I said, oh, that sounds great. What should I do? I mean, they're like, well, you wouldn't be good in accounting. You should go work on Wall Street. And I had no idea what that meant. George Mason didn't certainly have any Wall Street firms recruiting there. So I went about getting a job on Wall Street and started out at Solomon Brothers in their investment banking 2-year program, and which was like hell, the best way to describe it, working 80 to 100 hours a week. And I was one of 3 women out of 70. There's a lot of stories there, but in terms of my career shifted after 2 years, you're out of a job. We had a recession going on. I had to pay my rent. I didn't get into the Ivy League schools of Stanford, Northwestern, and Harvard rejected me, even though I had incredible credentials. So luckily, I found a job internally and just was grateful to be able to pay my rent in equity research as a housing associate for a gentleman by the name of Bruce Harding, who just picked up the group as a favor because the lights were going out at Solomon. There was a big treasury scandal, and he picked it up as a favor. And that's how I got into equity research. And I've been doing it for 30 years.
Wow.
Interesting.
There's a lot of questions in that, in all of that. Well, I'm sorry. So I have to ask, just because you mentioned this, and just knowing sort of how this has shifted. You said you were one of 3 women out of 70 people at the organization.
Or 70 in the training program.
In the training program.
Yep. And actually, I was so intimidated because they were all Ivy League graduates, and here I was, state school, and 2 years older than most of them. And, felt like I had to prove myself. And it's just funny because decades later, sort of BSing with one of the guys that I was friendly with. And I was like, oh my God, I was so intimidated. Because intimidated, we were like just totally intimidated of you. Like, how the hell did you get in?
Yeah.
And, so it was just sort of eye-opening. But I was really scared shitless that I was going to fail and be, completely called out for not being one of them.
Fear can be a powerful motivator, right? You should channel it the right way.
Yeah. That's been my whole life story, Keith. Fear.
Yeah.
I think I'm finally not afraid anymore, at least about my career.
Yeah, finally, huh? Yeah.
I'm afraid about other things. Not my career. I'm afraid of my children.
The image of you being intimidated by anything is actually hard for me to process, but I will believe you because it is your story. Maybe we'll do the rapid fire questions real quick.
Let's do that because I think it's fitting for this conversation. So,
here we go.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Keith, start us out.
Sure. All right. Keep it light and fun out of the gate. If you were a superhero, who would you be and why?
Wonder Woman.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Could see that.
Badass and hot. That's
It's checking a lot of boxes.
She has a great costume.
Yeah.
I think so. Sorry, my dog's barking.
That's all right.
All good.
That's all good.
Amazing. Okay.
Your dog's a fan of that answer too.
I'm going to close the door.
Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Easy.
Make it happen.
Okay.
Badass and hot are excellent.
I definitely want to get something Wonder Woman now to put on your shelf so that it's there.
Yeah.
All right. So
isn't that a great costume, right?
Yes. And it definitely, and a great series, and everything behind it. We actually have questions that are going to follow up related to that as well. Cause I think, Keith and I both have daughters, so we have questions we want to ask around that. All right. So real fast, favorite book or podcast this year and why?
Well, if I can have more than one, I read a book. I'm a big reader, but I read a book, Strength to Strength, by Arthur Brooks, that really was apropos for me as you think about where you are in your career and your life, and highly recommend it for people in my age cohort where you've been successful, and what's your purpose and where do you go next. So that was really enlightening for me and validating.
What was the title again?
From Strength to Strength. By Arthur Brooks. I loved another one, 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman. And 4,000 Weeks is basically 80 years of life. And it really talks about time management. And it did a fabulous job. I listen to it. I listen to audiobooks while I walk and work out. But I had a podcast I just love. It wasn't really a podcast. I just listened to it with Stanley Druckenmiller and Paul Tudor for 30 minutes. And it's just as phenomenal that you can Google and find it on YouTube or search for it, whatever. But it's just a few come to mind right now.
We always do these questions because it lets listeners and viewers pick up new stuff to listen to or research from, very interesting guests that we have on the show. So
it lets me add to my book stack.
Yeah. And Keith is a very, very avid reader. So, last question, Keith, and then we'll move on to our main subjects. So
if you could have lunch with one person, current or historical, who would it be and why?
Well, I just recently saw Condoleezza Rice at a conference that my parent company, Walker Dunlop, hosted in Sun Valley. And I had read her book. This was actually back 10 years ago. I saw her present at a mortgage conference, and she blew me away. And I read her book after I saw that. And just so much about her, from her struggles growing up in basically a racist world and not being able to go in restaurants and schools where everything was segregated. And then, being basically able to not only overcome that, but working as Secretary of State and also at Stanford being the provost. She's actually performed in front of the Queen playing piano, but she's also played at the Masters at Augusta. She said that actually the thing that she only really time she's ever got nervous was on the first tee when the entire staff came out to watch her. But she's just really fascinating, and she's also total badass. So I'd love to have lunch with her.
Yeah.
That's a good one. That's a good one. All right. Well, I'll lead us off, Keith, and then you can dive in on these. So, all right. So let's you're obviously, you have a lot of clients that you work with and advise. So let's start with one of the hot topics right now that's all over the news everywhere, especially in our business. Thoughts on the recent NAR class action suits that are happening, how it might impact the industry from your perspective. So,
I think that lawsuit is obviously now kind of front and center with other class action lawsuits piggybacking off of that one. I think it's going to really hurt affordability for buyers. Today, they certainly can't include it in the mortgage being financed. So it's another incremental cost for the buyer. I think it ultimately comes out of the sales price because the seller is going to have to accommodate what might be a difficult equation for the buyer to figure out, because they have to come up with a down payment. Now they have to come up with a cost that they'll have to incur that they haven't had to. So I think it's a negative for affordability, and it's certainly a negative for overall the realtor industry in terms of the bottom line margin to their business. I was actually chatting with a builder, asked his perspective, a large private builder on the West Coast, and he said, these guys bring in people, we never see them, they're worthless. And the fact is we got to pay them and they just don't do anything. So it's good for their business. So the builders are winning as a result of this lawsuit potentially. So I think the biggest thing that would concern me is just that it's more challenging for buyers now.
At a time when affordability
when everything's stretched. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So it just exacerbates the problem.
It's interesting because there's so many equations to this, and as far as how the system works currently, the whole idea is being able to help the buyer have representation in a very infrequent transaction that they do 2 or 3 times in their life. And a lot of the conversation is how this is going to affect minorities because they already struggle to be able to afford a house as it is. And then now potentially having to choose, in theory, whether they have representation or not in purchasing a property it's almost like, the lawyers in these cases are talking about how they're helping consumers. And you could argue both ways on it going, I don't know. You actually could be making this a lot worse for American consumers because they're not having this option to have help per se, in this process.
Well, they are. They're just saying you have to pay for it now.
Right.
You can have representation, but you just have to pay for it.
Do you think that the financing will change so that the commissions can be financed? What's your take on? I mean, you're in tune with this stuff.
I think that given the challenges that it will, the challenge that we face as an industry, or they face as an industry, is that affordability issue. So will Fannie, Freddie, Ginnie Mae, will they start to contemplate allowing it to be financed? It's possible. I think, there's skin in the game with a down payment, or very little skin if you're talking FHA or 100% financing for VAs. But, I think that it's a possibility.
Yeah. I mean, banks only make money when they lend money. Right. And so
they're struggling right now. I mean, the mortgage market is just, appalling right now and how bad it's doing. So I think they would want to figure out ways, but that's really not their decision. I mean, you're looking at the majority of loans are Ginnie, Fannie, Freddie, FHA, and so VA. It really will have to be a decision basically by the regulators, by FHFA, and the government.
Yep.
Before we move on to another question, how do you think all this shakes out? And are there going to be casualties? I'm assuming you're going to say realtors, but beyond real estate agents, are there going to be other casualties with with all of these cases and potential outcome?
Well, I think the industry is struggling right now. We're seeing tremendous pressure on bottom lines as a result of the lack of transactions. And, what we're seeing today, if you look at the total transaction in the United States, we're really looking at record lows with respect to historic measures that we look at. So if you take the recent print, 3.96 million homes annualized that was just printed for September, that divided by households is roughly 3%. That's actually the lowest level it is in pretty much every recession we've had going back to, 80, 81. So we're seeing really low levels. And so when you look at the brokerage industry, they really don't make a lot of money on transactions as it is. And so when the margins are so thin, and now you're taking away, incremental margin that the splits to the owner of the brokerage firm, I think it's gonna, we're gonna see some casualties. We'll see more, unfortunately, doors close, and we will see attrition and realtors. The incredible amount of realtors that came into the industry, we'll see an exodus of realtors leaving the industry.
What percentage are you forecasting? Sorry, Keith.
That's okay. No, go ahead. No.
What
we don't have
percentage?
forecasts for it. I would just say that, we're already seeing pressure on those numbers. I think that it's more challenging to bring in new recruits, but I do think that the, sort of party is over. And, that party where, 2020 COVID, it just sort of exploded. The industry had already been seeing an upward trajectory. I think that is going to just reverse. So if you looked at the numbers, which I haven't, say, okay, how many realtors did we have in I-19? Are we going to give back all those realtors that entered the market during COVID?
Yeah. It's the kind of classic boom bust of residential real estate as far as agents coming in, but it's just exacerbated, right? The volumes turned way up.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, help me, Ivy, because I'm confused. I need the Oracle of Ivy to guide
all
me.
Right. Go ahead.
I've never been, I'm not an economist, I am, but I try to pay attention, and I'm baffled. Credit card debt, way up. Savings, way down. Consumer confidence, down. Yet consumer spending, still ripping. And where are they getting all this money? And when does the U.S. consumer stop spending and finally just say, I surrender? Because everything else I look at says they should already have stopped.
Well, the savings is down, but it's not, depleted. It's certainly lower than it was during when, we're writing, stimulus checks and everybody was collecting money from the government. And I think what we're seeing right now is the cracks. The cracks are forming. We've been just super surprised on the resiliency of the housing market with respect to, at least on the demand side for the new construction market, has been very relative, robust, but we're seeing cracks there. We just published our October survey, and we're seeing really greater than seasonal weakness in October, incentives really picking up, and definitely pricing pressure now going to negative, where we had seen it reverse and started to incrementally increase. Now we're seeing it go negative again. So I think you're seeing signs of it, but we've been, like you, just baffled is your word. I certainly would think that it would be much worse, the economy, based on where we are with respect to the cost of debt. I mean, that being the biggest factor. But remember, Powell hasn't broken the back of the economy yet. We still have strong job growth, still have pretty strong wages. And until we really see employment come down, I think that resiliency is at risk as we see job growth decelerate.
For the October retrench, do you see is it an oversimplification to just say it's rates went over 8 and stayed there for a while, or is there other pieces going into that phase?
Well, we were trying to figure out how can the housing market going into 23 having reaccelerated after the 6 months of real significant weakness. How did it reaccelerate? Why did it reaccelerate? I think it had a lot to do with the builders had created, at least on the new home market, a lot of value through discounting and price cuts. So you had about net, some markets, including incentives, you actually saw as much as a 20% decrease in markets like Phoenix. So it ranged anywhere from 5 to 20, depending on the market. And, it was almost like safe to go back in the water and start buying again. And I think as you have a pent-up demand factor, because COVID, a lot of people didn't get to buy when they wanted to buy.
Right.
And so I think that those people were, waiting for the opportunity. They come in, and will that demand get depleted? We also have a tremendous wealth transfer that's happened in this nation, where we have, people like myself, not my kids are too young, but other parents, and I started later, but let's say my age cohort and a little bit higher are buying their kids' houses, and there's a lot of wealth that they're transferring. We also still have the arbitrage that, migrating to the north to south, west to south, whatever you may call it, but that's enabled more affordability to be mitigated, or the stretched affordability mitigated. But I think as we're starting to see that seasonal slowing, greater than normal. I think that the builders have been stepping on the gas, speccing more, and thinking it's, everything's great. And I don't think everything's great. I think we're seeing cracks, and I would be really cautious going into 24. And that's not even, I'm not an economist either, Keith, but looking at what Powell's strategy is and thinking about the cost of debt today and all these businesses that are negatively impacted. I mean, we're seeing, whether it be commercial real estate being the canary in the coal mine, or a lot of equity value that has been destroyed, handing back the keys to the bank, to the lenders, say, I don't want this anymore.
Right.
And so I don't know. I'm not convinced that we're, with
through it,
rates rallying today on CPI being, better than expected, that we're out of the woods.
You think he's still going to do rate increases then, potentially?
No, I mean, I'm not that smart to figure out if they're going to raise rates, but I could tell you that the, magnitude of inflation coupled with the lack of demand for U.S. bonds, long duration bonds, because unfortunately we have something called a, massive debt on the U.S. balance sheet at $34 trillion. And
we do?
Little debt with, almost $1 trillion in interest expense. But the Druckenmiller podcast was really entertaining because, you called out Janet Yellen and just like how horrible and the worst treasurer we've ever had, and she should be fired because the entire world refinanced, but she didn't, and kept issuing short-term notes. And so I just think that the deficit matters, and we have less foreign buyers buying, long duration treasuries. And so can the fundamentals overwhelm, meaning the fundamentals get weak? Does the, rates rally enough that we start to see a reacceleration in the economy, or are rates going to be somewhat sticky because of the challenge of the, impact of not having enough demand for those, today, those long duration bonds because of the economic state of this country?
So a lot of people, I'm simplifying here, from the economics of, we have a huge population, we have a shortage of housing from basically when builders stopped building in 2008 forward. What's the latest estimate? 5 million units short of housing in this country, something like that. Whatever, it seems to change to whoever you're talking to, but somewhere around that number. You've been. Keith actually brought this up. What's about 2 years ago, I think, Keith?
No, it was pre-COVID. So
pre-COVID, I was talking about how we have a housing shortage, and he was like, "Well, there's actually a different opinion that's out there right now." And then I was like, "What are you talking about?" And then we have a mutual friend who loves to look at all different stuff, and he's been talking about how there's essentially this oversupply. So I guess my question is twofold. Are we actually in a shortage, or is that what it is today? You've come out and said there may be actually be an oversupply. Give us some background on all of this subject. So
we don't believe there's a shortage. In fact, if you look at multifamily, we think we're currently about 30% oversupplied based on, the latest 12 months of starts and what's in backlog. On single family, probably more in balance right now. But I think that the view is, I think it's really comical, really, to be honest with you, because when you talk to, whether it's, CEOs of builders or realtors or anyone in the industry, they talk about this massive supply deficit, which, by the way, they don't forecast. They just listen to whether it be the Joint Center at Harvard or the NAR or Freddie, whoever's forecasting this. But everybody just assumes that the demand piece is going to be 1.5 million, because we've used that forever. That's the demand piece. Well, that's the demand piece is what you should be analyzing. And when we look at that 1.5 million, which also includes, demolition, obsolescence, so call it, the combination of demand is household plus demolition and obsolescence. What we're seeing is a significant decline in what really feeds household growth, which comes from population. Population fertility rates are massively down. Immigration's massively down. Death rates are climbing, even excluding COVID. And in fact, the Census Bureau just came out and gave us a little vindication, because we had forecasted for this decade population growth to decelerate from 8% to 4%. And they just finally caught up with us. And the Census Bureau now saying, oh, yeah, shit, we've got a problem.
I read this. It just came. I just read it.
Yeah. So why is the 1.5 million still being used? So, no, we don't think we have a shortage. And by the way, you can argue that maybe households would accelerate if we were offering people $500 a month, and we'd have people that are roommates or, living with parents. If we had affordable homes, either rent or for sale, we'd see a lot more people leaving that they're, undesirable living situation. But, let's look at it right now, which is, really interesting. The multifamily market is in really a challenging environment. We have all the predominantly, a lot more where we call it the smile states, the sand states, everybody's kind of like sheep. They all go to the same markets because that's where the population is going. And now we've got a lot of merchant builders and development that can't fill up these buildings. And they're having trouble. And guess what? They have new move-in rent growth for multifamily is negative.
Right.
And we're seeing pressure. So if we had a shortage, why aren't these multifamily units all being gobbled up?
Can you dig a little deeper on this, because Keith knows I'm fascinated with this subject a little bit. So essentially it's called the birth gap. Essentially, it's like, isn't it 2.1? You have to have 2.1 kids for every person in order to sustain. I believe this is the number, unless I'm off. Tell me. In order to sustain the population as it ages out, and so you're looking at China is like, oh my God, we have a huge problem. I've been reading about this as well. They're like, our whole like population control thing was backwards.
Right.
Japan, Germany, South Korea, they're all struggling with these issues. What does that mean if we have an oversupply? Like, give us sort of this long-term perspective of what that looks like from your view and how we would solve that, I guess, is a better way.
Well, I mean, I think that, I'm laughing thinking about this because my kids are like, the best thing that can happen is, we have less people on the planet because we've screwed up our planet. In fact, my 16-year-old said to me, well, she's 19 now. When she was 16, I remember laughing or sitting at dinner, and she says, your generation, Mom, has really handed us a bag of rocks. So, and how can you argue with that? This astute 16-year-old, now 19. But I think when you look at the demographics of the world, with the exception of maybe India and, I don't know, it was not China anymore, we're all seeing pressure on overall population growth. And that being said, in the US, what is that going to mean? Well, it's going to mean that you need a lot less incremental housing if you have less population, therefore less household growth. Mm-hmm. So if I'm getting your question right, longer term implications, it also, you can argue, is not good for the economy. Where are the workers going to come from?
Right.
What does it mean for economic growth for nations? If you don't have, and by the way, we got a real problem, which I don't get me on my soapbox, but we have.
I'm trying to get you there.
Our legislators, who are all old, right? Yeah. For the most part, the third rail is what should be front and center is raising the retirement age, because we live longer, we are working longer, and that might actually help reduce our deficit, right? If we actually reduced or increased the retirement age. But just think about all these people that are aging out and they're getting to the point where they're all going to get Alzheimer's or diabetes or heart failure. We're going to have a healthcare crisis. And so just where the demographics are going is not good. And it will help one thing, though. With, not to be morbid, but the more people that die, we have more incremental new inventory for the housing market, right? So we'll have empty houses, that vacancies will rise. And realtors are like, yay.
Yeah.
That will help.
Does this also, so let me take that a step further. Does that mean that we need to have a much more adult conversation, which is impossible in Washington, D.C., but an adult conversation about immigration?
Absolutely. We need immigration desperately. And really thinking about that's the way we solve for household growth. That's the only way we can solve for household growth right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it gets masked in the numbers because we all know the baby boomer generation is one of the largest generations. They're aging out, which you refer to. That's the polite term I use for dying and having their homes become available. And then when you overlay that with the millennial generation, they also are very large, right? But no one is looking at what's right behind the millennial generation. And that's where you really start to see the effects. And so it feels like it's this lazy logic where, hey, don't worry. I know all these boomers are aging out, but the millennials are going to take care of it. And no one's really paying attention to what's right behind that.
Well, when you think about generation, I guess it's millennials, the Y is now the alpha, or Generation Z is my youngest. I got two millennials, and then I got a Z, and then you get the alpha after that.
Yeah, and you left them a bag of rocks.
You're right, the alpha is the bag of rocks. But when you look at the rate of change, the boomers, the 1946 to 1964 is officially the boomers, post World War II, right? Mm-hmm. That cohort increased from the prior cohort, which is roughly 20 years. Each cohort is 20 years. Apples to apples, we have to adjust for the Xers and the millennials to try to make it apples to apples. But the rate of change is what matters. And the rate of change for the boomers was 53% increase from their generation. And when you look at the millennials rate of change, it was only like 14%. Mm-hmm. So that to me is more important than absolutes, because they're both roughly 75 million. So that's why people are like, oh, it's a huge cohort. But you're absolutely right. I mean, and my daughter, the oldest 23-year-old, and a lot of kids today are like, you know what? I don't want to have kids in this situation we live in today. And I just like, oh my God, I need a little Zoe. You can't say that. I want you to have babies, not yet, babies yet. But, I think a lot of you read in the paper, and just recently in the journal, there was an article about, young people are having one at most, if at all.
Yeah.
And there are reasons why of what we're talking about, geopolitical issues, the state of the nation. It's a very depressing time for young people to bring children into this world.
So I was just a side story because I think it's relevant. So I was talking to the president of the Canadian Association of Realtors. We were having a conversation. This is about maybe 6-8 months ago. We were talking about this. I forget the reason why. And he said that the head of real estate, I forget the title there, for Japan, flew out to Toronto to meet with him. And the entire topic of conversation, was about how they're trying to figure out how to get their population to have more kids. And they're designing buildings in such ways so that men and women cross paths to try and actually, I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up. He said it's literally designed in such a way that people interact with each other to try and stimulate conversation. And I'm listening to this going, you're making all this. He's like, no, the guy was calling me for 6 months. Finally said I'd take a meeting.
Aren't they also incentivizing people and giving them money for having more kids? Yeah.
So there's speed date tower. Is that that's what they're building, is speed date tower? That's something like that. So let's end on this, because I've read your book, Gimme Shelter, which is amazing. And James has a little girl, and I have two little girls in my life. Your book is about a lot of things, but the piece that I would love for you to opine about is a young lady, which you've touched on a little bit, coming up in a classically alpha male dominant Wall Street environment. What was that like? And I guess if you could help me have something that I could walk out of this room and go talk to my 11-year-old about, something that she could learn from Auntie Ivy.
I think it's about recognizing that we have a lot of helicopter parents out there today, and maybe arguably I'm included, versus where I grew up. I just watched Jerry Seinfeld in LA with my son last weekend, and he's like, when I grew up, it was lights out. What is this story shit? What is this singing and all this stuff happening? Toothbrushing and all this stuff, and even I did it. And we really nurture our kids. Whereas 18, I was out the door, and there was no support. My parents didn't even talk to me about college. So some kids go the other way, right? I got lucky. I never wanted to be broke. I wanted to be rich. I wanted to never have to be dependent on a man. So I think you start with that, Keith. Talk about resiliency, and that she could do anything she wants. And it comes from you and your wife really emphasizing that she should raise her hand in class. Never, don't let anyone intimidate her. Anything she has to say. Condoleezza Rice goes into a classroom, and this little white girl says to her, "You can't sit next to me." And she went home and told her dad, and he says, if she doesn't want to sit next to you, tell her she should move. So I think it starts with the parents. It starts with how you at home really, give them the courage to not stand down. I actually will make you laugh. My best friend, who I've been friends with since we were 12, her daughter was 12 when she came to New York and was visiting, and we were walking over to a theater district, and she started telling me about this little girl that was, giving her a hard time. And I said, just slap her across the face, just punch her. and honestly, and my girlfriend Lisa was like, Ivy, what the hell? And I go, she will never bother her again. And, me and my sisters would beat the shit out of each other. I mean, we just killed each other. I mean, and I think that having grown up in Long Island, New York, a public school, there was a lot of that. And I don't know that you could teach kids to be, tough. But I grew up in an environment, you go into a situation where there might be a bunch of kids that start picking on you, and you just can't tolerate that. Now, kids get, suspended, expelled. We were allowed to beat the shit out of each other.
Right.
Let's meet at the mini park.
I just figured out why Keith is a fanboy, because Keith's whole thing is when anybody ever gets mouthy with him, he's like, you know what? Let's just do this. Let's go to the parking lot and we'll just solve this together. It's like, I'll meet you outside. Nobody ever goes outside. So and then the problem's over.
I've been trying to get trial by combat. Yeah, I've been trying to get trial by combat.
There's a Crazy Uncle t-shirt, Crazy Uncle Keith t-shirt. It's trial by combat, by the way.
Well, I think it makes it like, you don't always get the right answer, but it's very simple, right?
Well, when I worked at Zelman Brothers, because I had a big mouth, I had a teacher throw an eraser. You read that in my book at me. Yeah. I was never afraid to say what I thought. And I don't know that my parents, I don't know where I got it from. But I think that when you go back to my days at Zelman Brothers, a lot of people would whisper and say, she's really aggressive.
Right.
And I would hear comments and, oh my God. And I say, I'm assertive, not aggressive.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a good book for you guys with young daughters to read called Girls on the Edge by Leonard Sachs. It was a phenomenal book. And I wish I had read it years before my daughters were, teenagers. But I think that we as parents, we kind of have to let our kids fail a little bit. I think my greatest success was that I was on my own. Unfortunately, my parents didn't have the means to help, nor did they give a shit, to be honest. But that's another story. I was out there on my own. And I had to fend for myself. But you as parents, we want to protect our kids. We want to do everything. I'm also like totally responsible for, maybe enabling my kids. But they also see a mother who, by the way, makes a lot of decisions and works really hard that hopefully they've learned from. And I think that, and not accepting unacceptable behavior. I have a lot of slogans, but they know that, and they know they need to speak up. But I'm sure you guys are doing a great job. It's not easy, but with,
no.
just tell them to call me. I beat these girls up. I have girls. Oh my God. I did this thing at Miami of Ohio. I'm actually going to start teaching a class at Case Western in Cleveland next spring, one class. But I cannot believe these kids. Okay, so this girl this was actually at George Mason, not the Miami. I was at a dinner with these young women, and she was telling me about her internship over summer. And I said, well, did you talk to, do you ask questions? She says, well, I didn't want to really bother anybody. I was like, oh my God.
You're there to bother people.
Yeah.
Right. And I just think there's so much fear of I don't want to raise my hand because I might have the wrong answer. When I was at Case, I was had an informal interaction with 30 kids, and I literally call them out, because they just don't want to talk. They're all so shy. And I guess you just have to tell people, say what you think, and don't be afraid of a backlash or being wrong. It's okay to be wrong.
Right.
And I'm wrong a lot.
Keith, I want to ask one more question. Do you mind before we, I know this is totally off the cuff because you just said, speak up and just you want to. I think it's just relevant. What would you do right now with your brain's fascinating to me. What would you do right now with Washington D.C. and this debt fight that's going on? I'm going to go 180 for a second. I just have to hear should we be addressing this $34 trillion? Is this going to affect housing if we keep running it up? What would you do if you were in this situation right now?
It's such a comical, situation we're in. It's a sad comedy. It's like the theater. We're now going to shut down again. I was talking to this woman who works at the IRS who's auditing me. I think I'm going to be okay, but she's like, I don't know if I'll be able to talk to you. I might not be able to talk to you. We're going to be shutting down. But, in reality, we need better leadership. I mean, we need someone who's not geriatric, for God's sakes. I mean, but yes, we need to cut spending. We need to raise taxes. We need to raise the retirement age. And we have to take the deficit seriously because you know what? The only reason we're not Venezuela or Honduras or any of these third world markets is because we're the reserve currency.
Yep.
And I'm not smart enough to know much about it, but if we weren't the reserve currency, which we probably always will be, we would be no better than a lot of third world nations, given our balance sheet today. So I think that, yes, we have to address the deficit. It could be painful, But if we don't, your children, my children, it's just not, the world's not going to get better. We can't just get the cocaine and the crack, keep getting lower rates to fix everything. And I think Jay Powell's got that, and I hope that he sustains that. But what we have in leadership in Washington, I mean, I don't need to tell you guys how pathetic we are right now.
All right. Well, I think that's a good way to the geriatric cocaine, and I think was the last one. We'll leave it there.
And buy Girls on the Edge and read it so that we can be better fathers to our daughters.
Ivy, this was awesome.
Yes.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for your insights on everything, including the parenting advice. Awesome. Nice. We appreciate that. So we'll have to have you back, and then we can in a year and be like, where did we all end up?
How do we do? So thank you, Ivy.
All right. We appreciate it. We'll see you soon.
Okay, take care. Thanks.
Bye.
Listen, we care about you deeply, which is why we never want you to miss an episode of this podcast. Subscribe now. It's just a push of a button.